It's being called a dirty war. Facing off are the European Union and Europe's last dictator, the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko. The two sides are locked in a tense conflict along Poland's eastern border. Thousands of migrants, mostly from Iraq, Syria and Yemen, have quite literally been dumped there. Many say they want to make their way to Germany. Poland, though, has adopted a tough approach designed to keep its borders firmly closed. And it's being suggested that Vladimir Putin is pulling the strings in the conflict in another bid to destabilize the EU. Meanwhile, the refugees are largely forced to fend for themselves in freezing conditions. So, on To The Point, we ask hybrid warfare with migrants, who can stop Lukashenko? Well, thanks so much for being with us on To The Point. And with me in the studio are Katsiaryna, Shmatsina, a political scientist at the Belarusian Institute of Strategic Studies. She says Belarusians are concerned that Angela Merkel's communication with Lukashenko might only serve to legitimize the dictator. Also with us is Christoph von Marschall, senior diplomatic correspondent with the Berlin daily Tagesspiegel, who believes that at the EU border with Belarus, Europe finally seems to prevail against the dictators Putin and Lukashenko, thanks to determination and unity. And a very warm welcome too to Alexandra von Nahmen, the head of DW's Brussels bureau, who argues the autocrats know the EU's weaknesses and how to exploit them. To stop that, the bloc needs to fundamentally reform its migration policy. Well, very interesting stuff, plenty to talk about. So let's get going, beginning with Katsiaryna, because it's such a disturbing situation along the border between your country and Poland. And I just wonder, what your thoughts are at this point in time.
So, first of all, I would say that the tactics that Lukashenko has been using to artificially create this migration crisis is one of the few sort of reciprocity steps he can apply to respond to the sanctions and the pressure that EU has been applying towards him in the light of the recent crisis. And he seems to find a really sort of sensitive spot for EU with this migration issue. And this is happening, of course, this is horrible, the way that migrants and people who are in need and dire situation are used and manipulated. And there are multiple evidences that those people cannot actually move freely once they arrive to Minsk. First, they arrive there with sort of false promises that they will have comfortable conditions and that they will easily cross the border. And also, there is evidence that the Belarusian siloviki, or sort of say law enforcement, they do not allow those people to move freely or to decide freely whether they want to, let's say, apply to submit some documents to, let's say, Polish embassy in Minsk, for instance. Rather, they are brought to the border and not even to the to this points where you can actually legally cross the border, but they're encouraged to break through the woods and to use some sort of loopholes in the border infrastructure. And at the same time, this is all happening at the time of continuing Belarusian crisis, when the repressions continue against the civil society. And I'm just bringing this to the attention that in the Belarusian society has this exhaustion and escalation when they see that there are migrants coming in, and then there is this whole tension and mistreatment of them.
It's a desperate situation. It's a very, very chaotic situation. And now Germany's caretaker leader, Angela Merkel, has got involved as well. She has twice at least spoken to Mr. Lukashenko by telephone. What do you make of that? That hasn't gone down at all well with many people in your country.
So if we talk about Merkel's attempt to establish some point of communication with Lukashenko, it is perceived as a very contradictory decision in the Belarusian society and among the Belarusian democratic forces, because they are concerned that this could lead eventually to some sort of legitimization of Lukashenko regime. And the concerns are sort of based on the previous years of experience, how the EU tended to engage with Lukashenko in the previous years when there were sort of crackdowns on the opposition, then a few years of isolation and sanctions, and then again the normalization of relations because Lukashenko managed to stay in power. And then in the current situation, when we have hundreds of evidences of tortures and multiple deaths related to the protest, when, again, like the civil society is in a dire situation inside the country, there are concerns that, let's say, if you communicate now with Lukashenko, you sort of give up or
I think,
to the blackmailer.
I've got the message loud and clear, and it's a very, very important message, I understand. Christoph, what's your take on that, Angela Merkel's role in this, her intervention?
It is typically Angela Merkel. She would probably argue that also in hostage situations or in kidnapper situations, we would talk to the hostage takers, to the kidnappers, in order to solve the crisis at hand. Of course, she has to be careful in two respects. First of all, not acknowledging him, and we heard that from the reports. She didn't address Lukashenko as president of Belarus. She just addressed him as Mr. Lukashenko. And the second thing is she has to talk to her European partners. It can't be seen as Germany going it alone and deciding for Europe what we do. And that's probably rather a question to Alexandra Nahmen in Brussels, whether this communication happened, whether there is a sort of unity. My sense is that at the moment, the EU fared much better than in earlier crises because there was more determination, more unity, and also a higher readiness to take harsh measures. Normally, one would say in the old times, what Poland did there, really harsh measures, how they treated the migrants, that wouldn't be accepted in Germany or the Netherlands and so on. But this time, official politicians in Brussels and in the member countries didn't criticize Poland too openly that they did that. So there is a sense we have to be united, otherwise we can't deal with dictators like Vladimir Putin or Alexander Lukashenko.
OK, interesting stuff. We'll go to Alexandra in just a minute. But let's go to the situation on the ground. And with temperatures falling, men, women and children have been struggling to survive, with Belarus pushing them out and Poland refusing to let them in.
The images have been similar for weeks. The events at the border are not what the migrants expected. Very few make it to Poland. A Syrian man said that Polish soldiers pushed him back and that Belarusian soldiers then refused to let him return.
He just kicked me in the face. He broke a bone here, broke my nose, 2 teeth, and I still have a painful rib.
The situation is escalating on both sides. The migrants' hopes are dashed.
We heard about the line that there is in the media, and there is a line from Minsk to Poland and from Poland to Europe. And it's a dream. Let me tell you honestly, it's a dream for anybody in Syria to come to Europe.
Should Europe take these people in?
Alexandra von Nahmen in Brussels. Should Europe take these people in? The question is yours.
I think that the majority of politicians in the European Union and in member states think that it should not be done at this moment, in this situation, even though we, of course, have some politicians saying that it's important for the European Union to show that they are not as brutal as Lukashenko, that they stand for humanitarian rights, for human rights and for helping people when they need humanitarian aid. However, I think that the majority now really is convinced that it's not only about migrants, it's also a geopolitical problem, and it's important to send a strong message saying, look, we are not going to give in, we are not going to back down here. You can try to blackmail us,
Alexandra,
but it's not going to work.
it sounds as though the message is that the EU has to choose between the integrity of the border and the situation of the migrants, and it's leaning towards choosing the integrity of the border.
Yes. In this case, I think that's the case. Your analysis is totally right. But this is the case because we are talking here about an autocrat, a ruler who would do anything to stay in power, who is trying to blackmail the whole bloc. And I think that's just like Christoph just said, it's interesting to see that the European Union and its member states, even though they don't agree how to move forward on the topic of migration, they are presenting here a united front.
And could Lukashenko escalate the situation still further? Is that the fear now?
Yes, I think that especially Poland is very concerned that there could be a further escalation of the situation. Just look at the footage we just saw and just remember what happened this week. We saw water cannon and tear gas being deployed, being used against migrants at the border. The people there are trapped between razor wire and soldiers. And the Belarusian and the Polish border guards are standing in a standoff that could escalate any moment. So I think that not only Poland, but also other member states are very concerned about that.
It's a very, very difficult situation. Christoph and Marschall, the dispute has been described as a non-declared war. Where could it lead?
Well, as all these asymmetric wars, it depends how the attacked party reacts. And from my point of view, it is a question of determination. People like not only Lukashenko or Putin, also Turkey's President Erdogan, are not taking the European Union seriously. We have seen that all along over the last years, how Mr. Erdogan treated the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She had to sit at the smaller table. How Putin treated the responsible for the common foreign policy, Josip Borrell, in Moscow. That was just showing no respect by sheer will. And the European Union has to find out how she can earn the respect. And I think it's just by showing, yes, we have our measures as well. The European Union is not a highly military armed bloc, but we have economic power. And the European Union is 7 times more powerful when it comes to the economic front. And why aren't we using this possibility in order to make people like Lukashenko and Putin show more respect for the European Union? And this is a small step.
Let's give Katsiaryna the opportunity to answer that question from your perspective. What do you expect from the European Union?
I would say that from the side of the Belarusian democratic forces, we expect that the democratic opposition and people on the ground, they would have this, that the EU would continue supporting Belarus, also with the sanctions, and sort of adding, like, while the EU provides even like the rhetorical support to the Belarusian pro-democratic forces, it gives the democratic forces more political weight, also when dealing with Russia, because there are some attempts, let's say, of the Belarusian groups, democratic groups, to reach out to policymakers in Kremlin. Of course, they are not perceived seriously and they're mocked at, and there was this interesting case of capturing several opposition figures in Moscow recently and deporting them, in April, and deporting them to Belarus, and they're currently in prison. But there are still attempts of the democratic forces to present themselves as a constructive political force when dealing with Moscow, not to over-agonize Russian sort of geopolitical appetites, but also to present themselves as a constructive political force who wants to seek constructive ways out of Belarusian crisis, and also to have balanced foreign policy in the future when Belarus is a democratic state.
OK, and Christoph, one term that we haven't mentioned yet is this is being described as a hybrid war, as hybrid warfare. What does that mean in this context?
Well, Lukashenko is under sanctions of the European Union because, from the Western point of view, he stole the election, the last election. He is not the legitimate president. So he's under sanctions. Lukashenko wants to get rid of the sanctions, and he was looking for some tools how he can do that. And he was flying in migrants from Arabic states, from Turkey, with a tourist visa, and then transporting them to the border and pushing them to the border, because he wanted to have a situation in which he would win this PR war. If the migrants would break through, the European Union would look weak. If the Polish border guards are reacting in a too strong manner, if he would have casualties by using weapons. There have been already casualties,
exactly.
some, but that was because of hunger and the cold and so on. But if it would be much more force used, then the European Union would look like an organization which is telling people you have to act in a humanitarian way, but then it's just breaking their own values. And so he would be the winner. And so it is a very tricky thing for Poland and the EU member states and Brussels, which tactics you use and which not, in order not to let Lukashenko win.
Alexandra,
Peter,
would you like
yes.
to comment on that? Yeah.
Yes, I would like to comment on that because I think we should be careful what language we are using. The European Union is talking about a hybrid war. NATO is talking about a hybrid tactic. And some officials in Brussels told me this is a war situation on the Poland-Belarus border. And I think it's, of course, important to describe what is going on there. But when we talk about a war, hybrid war zone, it's sort of making us forget that we are talking about people who are trapped there on the border. So I'm convinced that we should be careful using that language.
Okay, I understand and I appreciate that, and we shall be cautious. But let's just listen now to a short passage from Alexander Lukashenko explaining his mindset. Perhaps that's one way of putting it. Let's have a look.
You've enforced sanctions against me, against Belarusians. You've started a hybrid war against Belarus using mass media, economically, politically, now militarily and in terms of security. And you scumbags and madmen want me to protect you from migrants too?
It's difficult, given that kind of language, to remain cautious in the way we express ourselves. Question mark.
Yes, it is difficult, of course, and that's why also understandable why it is important for the European Union to show that they are not backing down, that they are not giving in to his demands. At the same time, we have experienced in the last weeks how difficult it is to solve any sort of crisis if you don't have any communications open, if you just don't have a way to put more pressure on someone or just to talk what is possible on the ground. So that's also a big problem.
Yeah, very important point. Katsiaryna, who is pulling the strings in this crisis? Is it Lukashenko or is it Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think Lukashenko is again using whatever means it takes to preserve his positions, and Lukashenko is staying in power in large due to large support of Moscow. Because if it was not for Moscow sort of security, economic, and political reassurances for his fellow autocrat in Belarus, then Lukashenko did not have a chances to stay in power. And I think here it's interesting that let's say, like, Moscow is indirectly benefiting from overall Belarusian political crisis because they're using the weakness of the official Minsk right now. And then Belarus becomes more sort of prone to some sovereignty trade-offs in exchange for Russian money and political support. And also in this crisis, I think that Putin is benefiting through sort of indirectly testing the patience of NATO and testing the way of sort of consolidation, the strength of the EU border here, although not being directly involved into this conflict, and also sort of waiting when the European leaders would reach out to Putin to ask him to handle this like little autocrat on the border, like a troublesome guy in the neighboring country.
Okay, well, talking about Vladimir Putin, he seems confident that he knows precisely where responsibility for the crisis lies. Let's listen into what he has to say there.
I want everyone to know that we have nothing to do with it. Everyone's trying to put some responsibility on us for whatever reason or for no reason. One must not forget where the migrant-related crisis came from. Is it Belarus that paved the way for these problems? No, the causes were created by Western countries themselves, including the European countries.
Alexandra, Vladimir Putin says the West is to blame, and I think what he's getting at least as I understand it, was that it was the West that first of all used migrants as pawns in geopolitical games, at least in the European region.
Well, I think what we have to stress here is that it's Lukashenko who is to blame for the situation. His regime has encouraged and is encouraging migrants to come to Minsk, and then his security forces are facilitating their transport further to the border. But it's important to understand that autocrats and dictators such as Lukashenko or Putin, of course, they know what the EU's weakness is, and this is its division on this important matter of migration and how to deal with migration. And that is why, of course, they use this matter to try to exploit it, these divisions, and to try to sow disunity. And so they want to see chaos and the destabilization of the European Union.
Well, taking up that point, it was very interesting. You said earlier, or at least we quoted you saying earlier, Christoph, that you believe that the EU is at this point really more united than divided. You were pretty upbeat.
Yeah, more united or less divided than, let's say, 5 years ago. It is not an ideal situation. Have we learned the lessons to the goal that we are really united? No, one could argue, but it seems to me much better than it used to be. And we understood that Putin is the threat, because if you look at the situation, Putin is not a strong man. He has not a strong country. Russia is no longer a superpower. So if he wants to deal with us on the same level, he has to pull us down, because he's not able to make Russia as powerful as the European Union is when it comes to economics and the political weight and so on. So we have to try to close the door to this threat, and determination and unity is one of the things which are successful, as we can see on the Belarusian border.
Just give me a relatively quick take on a lot of people have been saying this is somehow similar, the situation now on the border, to the situation back in 2015.
No, it is not.
It's not.
It is much. In an overall sense, it is much less threatening. If you remember what the summer 2015 and the following winter looked like, more than 1 million people were coming. These were really people walking by foot from Afghanistan, from Syria, from other war places, Iraq, to get to a safe place, but not only a safe place, also a rich place, which is Europe. Here we have a totally manufactured crisis. This is not the normal route you would take as a migrant from Iraq, from a war zone, or from Syria to Europe. That's you fly with a tourist visa on a normal commercial flight to Minsk. This is clearly manufactured, and that makes it also easier for the European Union to respond, because we have these two things. There is our wish to act in a humanitarian way, and there's the wish to defend the outer border of the European Union. And as we discussed earlier, the European Union at the moment is leaning towards defending the border and not so much act in a humanitarian way,
so finally,
because the situation
EU
is
comes
different.
to speak as one voice, and the one voice says, shut the border.
Yes, and some people disagree, but they don't shout it out loud as they would have done a few years ago.
Katsiaryna, I know that you and some of the people close to you have been working on scenarios for where to go next, how to get out of this very brutal and disturbing situation. What have you discovered? What have you come up with?
Well, first, those scenarios were more of like a war game, intellectual game simulation, and we don't think about the most probable way. We just think what happens if, let's say, the social mobilization inside the country remains slow, and then the regime manages to preserve its powers, or there is some, let's say, like black swan factor jumping in, facilitating the developments, and some sort of political transition happens, and then this would be published on through the Minsk Forum Conference, which is taking place tomorrow in Berlin, so you could check this out. And then when it comes to the recommendations that those experts from Germany, Belarus and Poland developed, there are multiple suggestions, but one of them is to seek ways maybe to include the Belarusian issue on the EU-Russia negotiations agenda, something similar to the approach used for Ukraine. But this is also some sort of like a broad question. It it cannot be decided sort of overnight because there are many caveats here. But if this kind of negotiations happen, if EU decides to, let's say, speak to Putin about Belarusian crisis, there are several hard stance issues that should remain, which is the release of political prisoners and new presidential elections. Do not settle for whatever Lukashenko tells you. Do not trust him.
Lots of great ideas, a lot of great strategies. Where do you think this whole situation, the mood at the present, as we move into the winter, what is the situation for the hundreds of thousands of people who have been arrested in Belarus and so forth, who are now have no future? It would seem it looks more like a very bleak winter.
So it's important to understand that the protest mood has not gone anywhere, but it has been sort of destroyed and put underground by the repressions. And literally, as we speak, the number of political prisoners is growing. So the situation is harsh, but people are waiting for some sort of a new window of opportunities for the protest.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a great debate, but we've run out of time. We've been talking about hybrid warfare with migrants. Who can stop Lukashenko? I hope we've given you plenty of food for thought, and if we have, come back next time. Until then, bye-bye and tschüss.